We're going to get started. Senator Pryor should be arriving shortly. The senators have, I think, both conferences have had retreats today, so we're delighted that Senator Coburn, who committed early to come and be here, we're just delighted he could be here. He's been in the Senate since 2004. He was first elected, reelected in 2010, and one of the things he's talked about a lot is elimination of government waste, making that a priority, releasing the annual waste book, and he's actually somebody, I mentioned this earlier, I said some of these GAO reports that David Walker and some of the fine people at GAO have written, been requested by Senator Coburn personally, and everyone I think knows full well Senator Coburn's also a medical doctor, but something I hadn't focused on, he's got an undergraduate degree in accounting, so he not only he's a rare breed here, a doctor, and he knows his numbers. He puts that to good work in the Senate for sure. And Senator, today we start off with Denny Werfel, the federal controller from OMB, and we've had 4 of our business roundtable CEOs that were here, and they've talked about transformation in their own company. And then we've had some veterans from state and local government, and certainly David Walker, our former GAO head, and now leading Comeback America Initiative. And we had former HUD Secretary, the SBA head Steve Preston, Mayor Steve Goldsmith, Governor Tim Pawlenty, and leaders like Mark Bernalini, was kind of may have seen it going out the door from Aetna, and Matt Rose from BNSF Railroad, and we had the key guy kind of behind this all, really, in some ways, is Jorge Beniquez from Accenture, who kind of helped put all this together with us. And so we've had a good group, and then we had Dave Melcher from Excelis. So they've talked about things that need to be done, and we've talked about the need for the president to have some kind of organization authority. That President Reagan, the last president, enjoyed that. But we also fully aware Congress has got a pretty key role in trying to make government more efficient, and with all of the sequestration across the budget cuts looking at staring us in the face, this is kind of an opportunity to do some of this. Dave Walker's put forward some interesting ideas about mechanisms. Even OMB talked about the need for structured mechanisms, but our thought is that maybe there's a way that we can all help. But just let's start off with your thoughts maybe on how bad is the problem, and what can we do? It looks to me like this is more of a legislative versus executive contest at times, and but you've been a veteran in the field doing this work, so. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. When you talk about transforming government, the one thing that most people in business understand is if they have area of responsibility, they have the authority to carry it out. And the biggest problem in the federal government is you bring in somebody that really is good, and they don't have the authority to carry out. And so the first thing that really needs to be happen at the federal government level is changing the rules at the Office of Personnel Management. If you don't change those rules, it doesn't matter what reform you put in. If you don't give the line authority to the person that has the responsibility, you're not going to be able to. And I'm talking hiring and firing capability, the ability to promote outside of a fixed scale that's determined by a union organization. In other words, if you can't reward great behavior and punish incompetent behavior or less than average behavior, then you can't manage it. And so the first thing that has to happen in the federal government, if we're ever going to get it under control, is to give line authority and responsibility to the secretaries. They have it to a certain degree, but then they're totally controlled by career people who may or may not be performing. And this isn't political philosophy. This is about performance. We just did a study. The average federal employee makes $59.85 an hour, fully absorbed. But they work 3.8 weeks less per year than the average working person in this country. And the average private sector employee makes less than $28 an hour, fully absorbed. So we're paying for twice as much, but yet we get 3.8 weeks less actual work per year. And then you add to that the fact that you cannot terminate somebody for performance. In other words, direct line performance without going through somebody else who's already protected by OPM. And so we have a culture that is not designed to promote excellence, and to promote results. And I think until you change that, it doesn't matter what program or who you bring in at an executive level, you're not going to get the kind of response you want because you're not going to be working under the same guidelines that we know work in the private sector. And so I think that's our biggest challenge. And that's a legislative challenge, John.
One of the things that we talked about, Senator, was the prospect of, when you're looking at, say, across-the-board cuts, department by department, agency by agency, and most of them are included, but there's some of us have had experience with that. Others, we look at that in the private sector, you'd probably say, well, look, manager, and maybe the president or the chief executive would say, look, I'll look at that, but I can do better, but you got to give me the flexibility.
I agree with that.
Then I'll cut 100% of this and none of that.
Well, just remember, sequestration is the coward's politician way of saying I was responsible. In other words, cut everything. In other words, I don't have to make a judgment decision about what works and what doesn't work. The GAO has been my best friend, and they got punished this year by the appropriators intentionally because they did such good work that showed the appropriation process how much waste we had. And, from whether it's 209 separate programs for science, technology, engineering, math, run by 11 different departments. The military has 100 STEM programs. And that's somewhere where we want to succeed. Nobody knows whether those are working. None of them have a metric on it. Here's an area where we want to be competitive in the world. We're putting money into it, and we're throwing it down a rat hole because we have no idea. Plus, the administrative cost of that is 10 times what you'd ever tolerate in a business, and just in terms of getting it done. So I'm fully supportive of giving any administration, whether it's of my party or another, the flexibility to do what they want to do. Matter of fact, one of the things, if we get into sequestration, one of the bills I have is to give the secretaries the flexibility to prioritize in other words, they say, here's what we're going to do. You have to vote affirmatively to stop us. So because sequestration is stupid. Cutting spending is not stupid. And I can show you $200 billion a year in waste, thanks to the former organization that David had. Waste. I mean, we got 109 green building programs. We got 47 job training programs, of which all but 3 totally overlap one another. That's right. We spend $21 billion a year on that, and we're not getting anything for it. And when you actually study it, the programs run by the states that have no federal government involvement actually work. And the ones that the federal government does don't work. And so they're very successful employing people in the job training business, but they're highly unsuccessful in terms of teaching people a skill that will put them on a life scale to advance themselves and let them taste the American experience.
Well, that's excellent. Senator Pryor's arrived, I note, so come right on up, Senator. We're delighted to have you. And
hey, Mark. How are you?
He's also fresh off, I believe, his retreating today.
Yes, I am.
Yes, sir.
It was a great excuse for me to get out of there. Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Pryor's got experience pretty relevant to our conversation today, and prior to being elected to the Senate, where he just won re-election in 2008, he was a state attorney general. He was a state legislator, so he's had a lot of experience. And what Senator Coburn's just kicked off is kind of a bit of a conversation, and throughout the day we've had a couple of very strong panels with some CEOs, some leaders like David Walker, and we talked about the transformation of government and the importance of that, because it does appear at a time when we're facing a lot of fiscal challenges that we can have a more effective and yet much more efficient government, and some of that deals with how we actually run the government and who's in charge, and how do we hold people accountable, and how do we create the flexibility so that if Congress is setting priorities through the budget, at least then those can be managed more appropriately by the executive, and that executives can request authority or Congress can give it, but somehow we got it to seem like got to work at this. And so maybe I just invite you to make any opening comments on the topic at hand, and then we're going to kind of have a little conversation, and we know you're on a pretty tight time frame here, so when we're done, we're done.
Well, great. If I could just take 5 minutes, if that's okay, and I'll just run through a few items. One is, and David maybe has already talked about this, is I think we're in a period now because of our deficits and debt. It used to be that policy dictated the budget. But I think now we're in a position where the budget may be dictating policy. That's just something to think about because we just cannot continue to run $1 trillion deficits every year. I mean, it's just completely unsustainable. So it's a reality that we have to deal with. And I also think it's time for us to give the president some what I would call fast-track authority to allow him to reorganize government. It makes sense. We used to do this. This authority expired back in '84. I know there's been a couple of initiatives on when President Clinton was in, reinventing government, when President Bush was in, the management agenda. I think one of the lesson from those two efforts is they probably did some good things, but they really don't translate into political success. You just don't get a lot of credit out there. It's the right thing to do. It's a smart thing to do. It's a way to stretch your resources, but it doesn't really show up at the ballot box. So there's not a lot of political incentive to do the right thing. It's one of those type of issues, but we still should do it. And I know that Senator Coburn has been an absolute leader for the last 10 years in the Senate on looking for ways to reduce duplication, to just try to make sure the government runs more efficiently, taxpayer dollars, et cetera. He has been phenomenal about taking things like GAO reports and other type studies, taking that information and really working hard to try to make government run more efficiently. And I think that his committee, that he'll be the ranking member of, the Homeland Security Committee, I think he's the perfect senator for that spot over the next couple of years. I think he's going to do a great job. And I think we're all excited about it because he's the right guy to do it. I think that one of the things that you all know instinctively, but I think that we should always remind ourselves here in the Senate and in the House, is we ought to take the best practices from the private sector. And if we can apply them to the government, not all those are going to apply to the government, but where we can, we should try to do that. So if it comes to things like, consolidating IT infrastructure, streamlining supply chains, coming up with a more rational way to do government contracting, doing things like sharing services across agencies, because, I just talked to the Department of Ag yesterday, and they're talking about that as a way to save money. It makes sense to do. Some of these ideas, based on some GAO reports and other studies, say that we could save about $1 trillion over 10 years. I mean, that's real money, and that's serious money, and we ought to do it. It's just a way for us to, be a little smarter, and we're obviously are looking for a way to stretch taxpayer dollars. And again, I think if we do our job in the Senate and in the Congress and do the oversight and give the direction and do the reform, again, it may not be a political windfall for us, but nonetheless, we owe it to the taxpayers to do it. Let me just run through 4 quick ideas that I was going to focus on some this year, and we've been focused on over the last couple of years. One is real property reform. Senator Carper and Senator Coburn had this bill last year, Real Property Management Act of 2012. There's about 900,000 federal government buildings. There's about 41 million acres of land. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year. I don't think that's an exaggeration, but we spend a lot of money every year with the upkeep, maintenance, et cetera, of a lot of buildings and areas and real estate we just don't need. I mean, it's just...
We're spending $8.1 billion
there you go.
a year maintaining properties that we're not using.
Wow. So, I mean, that you're talking about low-hanging fruit. I mean, that's it. We need to do it in the right way. There needs to be a process, and he's come up with, rational ways to do it, the right way to do it. So we need to do that. Another thing is improper payments. We did something in 2010, the Improper Payments Act, I think it was called, of 2010, if I remember correctly. And, that's been on the books now for, 2 years. And I think we have gone from a 5.42% to 4.69%. Well, that's progress. It's obviously not as much as you want to see. But I think total, that's something like $100 billion or something like that of savings a year that you can do if we get that right. And, again, we're just chipping away at it. Maybe there's ways we can do that better, and maybe we should, really be focused on that to continue to try to do that. Third is duplication of government programs. Here again, you're looking at the real expert on this, Senator Coburn. Has been phenomenal ever since he's been in the Senate. I think in the GAO in 2012 did a report that I think they identified, if I remember right, 51 areas that we should focus on to try to really drive costs down. Again, this isn't fun stuff. This is nuts and bolts stuff. You don't get a lot of headlines. People that pat you on the back, oh, good job, Senator, but really it doesn't translate into a political win, but it is the right thing to do, and I think we have a great committee. I think Tom Carper also is very committed to all this, and so again, we have the right two people running that committee. And the last thing I wanted to mention is something I've been working on with Senator Portman, and it's reg reform. And Senator Portman has 2 or 3 different efforts on that, but I have what I think of as the main bill. I think he would agree with me on reg reform. Basically, it does a dozen or more things, but in just a super brief overview, nutshell, what it does is kind of 3 things. One is it tries to get stakeholders in earlier, and this has been a problem with regulation. A lot of times the stakeholders, the people that know how it works in the real world, they're not invited in the process, if at all, until way too late in the process. So try to get them in earlier. Second is do a cost-benefit analysis. And you all know that may not, a cost-benefit analysis may not be appropriate in every single reg, but we ought to look at it. I think it probably is in almost every reg. But we have some laws right now that are silent on cost-benefit, but we have some laws that are actually prevent the government from doing a cost-benefit analysis.
Really?
Yeah, in the EPA world especially, you have some of that. So I think we ought to change that, and I think we ought to do a cost-benefit analysis. And then the third part, again, it does a lot more than this, but just in general overview, the third part would be that when the agency comes out with a regulation, and once they're ready to do that, they should try to find the least costly reg to get the benefit they're looking for, right? So we want, if there's a way that they can put a little less drag on an industry or on the economy or something like this, and they basically get the same result, they should try to opt for that. And I think that if we did that, I think we would basically modernize the way we regulate in the U.S. And by the way, what we're doing is we're changing the Administrative Procedures Act. We're not trying to just go after one agency like EPA. We're not trying to, we're saying across the board, we need to modernize the way we regulate. And honestly, I think the last time we had any major change to the Administrative Procedures Act was the 1970s. I mean, it's just time to revisit it. New century, new economy. Come on, let's get back in the game, and let's make sure that government regulation is ready for the 21st century. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator here, and you tell us what you need us to do.
Well, let me start with an easy question. Sarah, you kind of got this interest that you've talked very eloquently about, and some excellent ideas here on the table. You've got one committee assignment on the Appropriations Committee, and what's Chairman Mikulski's attitude toward this? Because I mean, sometimes these have run into appropriators who defend the turf, and Senator Coburn was just as you arrived, just going to talk about like one I was familiar with as a governor, 47 workforce programs,
right.
And they fall all over. Each one of those got an administrator. And getting that money back to Arkansas, Oklahoma, or Michigan, pretty good idea. If you could get more of it back, there's an example where there's probably a lesser cost and a more effective program around the corner if you could get there.
My impression of Senator Mikulski, and I'd like to get yours, Tom, if you want to offer any. If you're
well, I don't have any earmarks out there, so I'm not worried about any criticism.
So do you
don't have any Coburn children out there?
There's never been one.
So do you fall in the category, like the rest of us, that we all respected Senator Byrd, we all love Senator Inouye, and we're all scared of Senator Mikulski? Is that the way you are? So that's why I am. Okay. No, I'm kidding about that. But my impression of her is that she is kind of an old school appropriator. But at the same time, I think she recognizes the reality of where we are today. And when those allocations come out, and when you look at the numbers and you know that because of the Budget Control Act of 2011, our spending caps continue to decrease over time, I think that she's willing to think outside the box and try to do more innovative, more creative, more consolidation, more elimination, whatever it may be, because she's going to be trying to hit those numbers but still provide as many government services as she possibly can.
David, I don't know if you want to, I could ask a couple more questions, but I know the senator's time is tight. And you talked about a concept earlier, though, that I think is really important, because we were talking about a structure. How do you kind of tee something up in such a way that it can be addressed in an up or down, yes or no kind of way? And I mean, one of the panels earlier talked about BRAC, and even from OMB, Danny Werfel was talking about some kind of structured mechanism by which you could actually have a decision get made or get teed up so you could make it. You're not going to unilaterally probably have anybody making a decision, but collaboratively, can you get a process that works so that decisions get made and not punted? And David's got an idea on that.
Well, there's a lot of good work that gets done in the Senate, in the House, by GAO, by the IGs, frankly, by OMB, different administrations. But 90% of success or failure is implementation. And how do we get this stuff implemented? And there's a lot of vested interest. There's a lot of conflicts of interest, that have to be dealt with. And so the concept is there a way to create a mechanism that would allow for items, whether it be duplicative programs, whether it be real estate that's not being used, whether it be some of the human capital reforms that need to be made, whether it be reorganization authority that actually will save money, because a lot of times reorganizations don't save money, they cost money. Can we create a mechanism whereby there are a group of capable, credible, and non-conflicted people with proven transformation experience that the Congress, and the President would have some involvement with, who would take the good work that's being done, make findings and recommendations with guaranteed hearings and a guaranteed vote. Because there's a lot of good work that's been done in different administrations. I mean, whether it's a Grace Commission, whether it's the Gore efforts, whether it's the President Bush's efforts, but a lot of these things require congressional action, and there are details that I'm happy to go into it on another occasion, but process matters and results count.
Yeah, I look at Congress and kind of as an outside, my business experience before going into medicine, what I see the difficulty is Congress thinks short term instead of long term. They think parochially instead of in the best interest of the nation, and that's the nature of politics. If you want to stay here, you have to be concerned with the parochial concern. So the question is, and what always happens to us, I've offered hundreds of amendments based on what GAO has done. Nobody disagrees it's the right thing to do, but I never win the amendments because somebody else's vested interest trumps it. So it's going to have to be something like that. And even if you do something like that, David, unless you change OPM and the guidelines, so Mark mentioned, we've made some improvement on improper payments. Any business out here would accept your accounts payable department paying 4.2% of the payments improperly? Would the head of that department be fired? I'll give you a great example. Air Force just last week, or 2 weeks ago, canceled a $1.1 billion enterprise system for IT. I listed it 2 years ago, based on the stuff we did, that they should cancel it. So they canceled it, paid an $80 million cancellation fee. The person that was responsible for that contract didn't get fired. There's no lawsuit back against the provider of that IT on why you didn't perform. So in other words, that's the kind of business transformation we need. We need accountability and creating the expectation that you're going to perform or you're going to be held accountable. And it's with vendors, it's with employees, it's with members of Congress. It's just like on the oversight. Are we going to do the oversight that's necessary to identify the problems?
One thing I hope we do, and I want you to finish up, but one thing I hope we do in the committee this year is, 2 or 3 years ago, Carl Levin and I guess McCain, I'm not quite sure, passed a law as part of the NDAA about defense contractor reform. And it's been on the books now for at least a couple of years. It's time, I think, for us to see how that's going. And there again, that gets back to oversight and congressional action and all that. And there's a lot of vested interest there as well. So I hope at some point we have time
our
to do
problem
that.
with contracting, especially on major weapon systems, is we do cost-plus contracting without any capital exposure of the business that has won the contract. And if you want to control costs, what you got to do is have some capital at risk by the people that are going to benefit from this wonderful contract that they're developing the product for. And so we need to change the parameters under which, and I've talked to GE and a couple other of the defense contractors about that, and they reckon, because remember, they're put in a position. There's no grown-up in the room when we start, and Dave Cody can give you a great example about the backpack helicopter. If you ever see him again, ask him about it. Because they kept adding bells and whistles. He was on time and on budget, and they kept adding bells and whistles, and something that worked, that would have really helped our troops, got ruined because somebody wanted to make it a little bit better. So no grown-ups in the room when we do these acquisitions. And that's because there's no true line authority. And there's no accountability for some lieutenant general or brigadier general being held in line. Why'd you blow this contract? We just don't have it. So until you have line authority and responsibility combined, no matter what system we put in, David, it's not going to get executed. Because you're asking a business manager to try to run a business without the tools that are necessary to run the business side of it. And so that's, I'll never win this debate in Congress. I know that. And it's not because they don't care. It's they don't have an understanding of running a business.
Clearly you have to match responsibility with authority, and we don't do that in many cases. And you're putting your finger, Doctor, on something that's very, very important. If you don't have the right incentives, if you don't have adequate transparency, and if you don't have appropriate accountability, it ain't going to work.
That's right.
All right? So it isn't rocket science. But a lot of the things that you want to do, and, Senator Pryor, things that you want to do and others want to do, I think in order to make them a reality, there's going to have to be a special process. There's going to have to be a special process that has integrity, that people have some confidence in, or else we're going to continue to be frustrated.
And I would just say I agree with that, because if you look at the sequester, here's our answer to it. Just cut everything.
Yeah.
Well, that is the most asinine position we could be in.
Yeah.
Because some programs really work well and others suck, and we're cutting them both the same amount.
No, I think the federal capital Capex project or process is just, well, there isn't one. That's the problem. I mean,
Yeah.
There really isn't, and it's different than virtually every state and certainly every company that I'm aware of. You're right. Somebody has to be accountable, and we would run into the same thing at state level. You concentrate everything so that you've got some decision makers who are expert in administering what you're trying to do, and then you take the input, but you don't let. We used to have the problem in the human services system. They walk in, they say, well, once this happened, let's redesign it for that. So you're trying to write it for 110% rather than getting the 90-10 solution that can pretty much go off the shelf.
Yeah.
And I also want to bring everybody else in here. If there are questions out there, we've had a pretty interactive audience today, and we've had a room full earlier. We've tested their patience. They've been here since 12:30, many of these folks. But so anybody else comment or question out there, please get it in your minds. Let me ask this question: is there a relative to Senator Coburn, Senator Pryor, as you were coming in, I had raised with this across the board, just picking up on that thread, and give you a chance to comment on this, because he made an interesting observation. If without getting into the, certainly I think most of us think sequestration, just going across the board, is a pretty blunt instrument and doesn't sort good from not so good. But if we get to that point, and that's what we're looking at, is that an opportunity for the legislative or the executive to kind of get a little creative and say, look, let's allow some discretion and let's let some judgments be made, and then come back and give us an alternate plan, because that done agency by agency perhaps could, or department by department, could at least yield a more tolerable result. And one of the problems with the public, I think there's probably very many people out there who don't think you can probably take 10% out of pretty much every agency.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Well, yeah, it's a very bad way to do it. And I'll give you one example from the Department of Agriculture. I met with Secretary Vilsack yesterday, and one of the examples he was talking about is if you look at meat inspectors, which is real basic. Everybody takes that for granted, right? We have the safest food supply in the world. We don't think there's ever going to be a problem because we have a very low percentage of problems when it comes to food here in the U.S. But meat inspectors have to be present in a plant when they're operating. And so it turns out in that particular agency, 90% of the budget is for the personnel out in the field. So if you start doing a 5% cut, you're almost, by mathematics, you're almost going to have to cut some out in the field. So what are you going to do? Are you going to start telling, poultry plants and, cereal makers and, whoever's using whatever they're making, you're going to start telling them, well, sorry, you can only run 4 days a week, or there's going to be 2 weeks out of the year you can't run. I mean, what are we going to do? And that is, I think we all agree that that's a program that's been very successful. It's been a great program. There's huge health and safety benefits for everybody. It's never a problem. It's not over budget. I mean, all those things, like any government program, maybe there's a little bit of inefficiency here and there, but by and large, they're doing what they're supposed to do. And so he's going to have to figure out a way under this sequestration to basically cut a lot of his field personnel.
Yeah, that'd be a good example where he'd leave that one alone. He'd go over here and cut 20%.
And he told me that there are things, obviously, that aren't working that, you can do and other things, but he doesn't have the flexibility to do it. So the 5%, the whatever it's going to be, 5% across the board cut is not the way to run a government. It's just not. And Senator Coburn's right on that. Is so many better ways to do it, and Congress's response on that. I mean, the whole idea of sequestration was you came up with something that was so bad that you would force us to get to a budget deal. And we didn't get there. And so now we have this.
Yeah, well, it was unthinkable. That's why we did it.
Yeah,
but now it's reality.
And, honestly, the fact that you're cutting defense in an equal or maybe even a little more of a measure than you are other domestic spending, again, that kind of puts the pressure on both sides to try to get to some resolution, and they still didn't get to a resolution.
Don't know if this is a reform or how you do it this way, but one of the things that was talked about today is obviously the need to pass budgets, but by both houses and signed by the president, but maybe not on an annual basis, but a biannual basis to kind of look at this. And you're really at this point now with 13 almost half over and 14 looming, you'd also have a better outcome if you spread that over a two-budget cycle. And
yeah,
it makes it difficulty goes up.
I haven't had a chance to talk to you about this, but I do think I've been here. We've been here 10 years in the Senate. We came in together.
No,
right?
I came in after you. You're much older than
I am. Well, I feel a lot older. What you won in what year? Oh, you won in 04, and I came in 02. That's right. So I've been here 10 years, and basically in those 10 years, and David can tell us the real numbers here, but basically.
It's 3 in his lifetime or 4.
Basically, we followed the budget law of 1974 once in 10 years, right? Where we didn't at some point, just totally blow through the schedule, and we didn't have to do a big omnibus or a CR or something. I think even in that 1 year, I don't think we passed all 12 appropriation bills on time, but I think I've forgotten, you know the number. We passed most of them, and then we had to do a little.
I'm 61.
Okay.
Congress has passed timely budgets and appropriations bills 4 times in 61 years.
Okay. So
the only thing you got to do in the Constitution every year is pass appropriations bills.
Yeah, and that tells you that our law, the law we have on the books, needs to be revisited, because obviously we're not doing it. Now, again, total respect for Senator Byrd. I mean, he and a few others wrote that law back in the 70s, and you take something like reconciliation. The whole idea of reconciliation, as you know, it's been turned on its head, but it was to actually reconcile the books at the end of the process where you could actually balance the budget. It's never really been used for that, or very seldom has it ever been used for that. So, we need to do that. That's a big task. Process-wise, you'd have to get the budget committees, the appropriators, the finance committee. You kind of have to get a lot of people together and kind of work through that. I don't know all the answers, but, obviously one problem is the budget law we have is pretty unworkable. So,
Part of the process where Congress is failing, the Congress has always been political, always been parochial. Where it's failing is in its constitutional responsibility to oversight what it does. I will tell you the vast majority of senators in the U.S. Senate have no idea the effectiveness of 99.9% of the programs. And I'm not sure I know how you fix that. The reason I've worked on it is because I'm interested in salt. That's my focus. And that's not to be critical of them. They have other focuses. But the whole idea of a biennial budgeting is not just so you can budget for 2 years, so you can spend a year oversighting what you've done to see what you need to make a change for. I mean, do you realize we appropriated $480 billion last year in appropriations for things that were not authorized? In other words, there's no authorization to come through a committee to do it. We just spent the money. So maybe we ought to talk about maybe even restructuring the committees to where you have authorizing and appropriating together so that everybody really knows what we're doing. Because I would tell you, they do some good oversight on appropriations, but they don't oversight the way we oversight.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like right now I have 4 investigators in New Jersey and New York looking at how we're spending Sandy money. That's never been done before. Well, the fact that we're up there is changing things. The fact that we're looking. That's what you do inside your businesses. You create the expectation that you're going to be watching. So I don't know what the answer to is. I'm open to biannual budgeting, but on time biannual budgeting.
Yep.
and there's also a political issue here, and I don't know if y'all have talked about it before I got here. If you did, I'm sorry, but I've noticed, and it's pretty clear, that in the Senate and House, for that matter, the party that's aligned with the president, of course right now it happens to be Democrats, but the party that's aligned with the president is way too lenient on the executive branch. In other words, what we've kind of done is we've allowed party affiliation to trump our constitutional responsibility of checks and balances. We should be just as hard, the Democrats should be just as hard on Democratic administration as we are on Republican administration and vice versa.
Same thing. Yeah, I agree.
And I remember during the Bush years, it was very, very hard to get anybody on the Republican side to say yes to trying to look at anything.
They quit inviting me to the White House.
Yeah.
Because I was.
Well, same thing, with this White House too. I mean, it's just, there's just a huge resistance to do it because of the political environment and the red versus blue world we live in and all that right now. And that's something, again, that's hard to change maybe, but that's something that just takes leadership and a change of attitude within the two bodies.
I will just, I think David, well, go ahead, David. Just flip over there.
We obviously don't have a parliamentary system. We've got different checks and balances. But in parliamentary systems, the government reform committee or the government affairs or government oversight committee is actually chaired by the opposition. They have the idea being that you don't want there to be a tendency for the party who has the power of the White House to be easy. That's not the only way to do it, but I think you're right. I do think that I saw it when I was Comptroller General that whoever controlled the White House, that party was not likely to be as aggressive in oversight.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I want to. Yeah, right. We've got Bill right behind you, and then we'll come back over there.
This question is directed to Senator Pryor. John Kamensky and I used to work for Vice President Gore's Reinventing Government initiative, and one of the things that we found was when we were doing regulatory reform is that all the policy attention by both the legislative and the OMB tended to focus on the development of new policy, and yet there was $800 billion worth of existing rules and regs, and nobody was looking at that. And I think that maybe in your legislative reform effort, one of the things you may want to do is to carve out something that looks at existing rules and how they're being implemented, because sometimes the way they're being implemented is cost ineffective.
Right, I think that's good. Senator Portman and I have talked about this, and our initial conclusion, and this could change, but our initial conclusion has been that because so many folks in the business community in the last few years have talked about uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty and all this, and legitimately so, I guess, but we didn't want to try to reopen every reg that's on the books. That'd be chaotic, we thought, in terms of uncertainty. But I do agree there should be some sort of mechanism in place where we do review regs periodically, and it may be different in different agencies, whatever. So we've been talking about that. I'm not sure we have a real firm conclusion on that yet, but that's a good point.
There's another solution to that, and that is when Congress writes legislation, they write it with limited knowledge. In other words, we really don't know what we're doing. And so then we tell the agency, do what we think we intended. And one of the things I've tried to do in the legislation is go all the way down, here's what we expect, here's what the parameters are, here's what we want you to do. Because then, all of a sudden, then you're carrying out the Congress's intent rather than trying to interpret it. And that's where we get the political games played, which changes from administration. Just think about the difference in hard-right administration, hard-left administration, and how you have to adjust your policies as the regulations get interpreted differently by a different administration. Well, that's crazy. We need to know enough about what we're legislating on to be specific about what we expect and how you do it. And if my staff can't tell me all the way down to the nth degree, then we're not writing a bill. You got to go back and learn this better. And so that's the real failure of the legislative body, is we do it part way and then say, oh, well, we don't have to understand it. You just do it.
I think you put your finger on something that represents perhaps the greatest gift of legislative authority one could have is the blank check to the agency. I mean, the fight sometimes about funding a little program that somebody created because that was legislative intent to have that. But meanwhile, over here is
that's right.
Is a trainload of a gift to an agency, which ultimately often requires a funding to follow. All the way in the back, I have a question.
Yes, I'm Charlie Clark with Government Executive. A lot of the waste and duplication is known best by the frontline employees, and I'm just wondering if you could address the issue of incentives and whether the morale of the federal workforce gets damaged when there's too much discussion of incompetence and whether and when their pay is frozen, for example.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would probably dispute. The only agency that knows every program it has is the Department of Education. There's not another federal agency that knows their programs. They can't give you a list. They can't post. That's why it was so hard. When we started on this process, and Mark was on the committee when we asked this, we went to CRS and said, we want to know all the government programs. I said, it's impossible. We can't tell you. I don't know if you were still there yet, David, but GAO told me the same thing. We can't. It'll take forever. And so we put it into law. We had a good bipartisan vote on it, and we set up a plan with GAO over a 3-year period. And we're going to get the last third of it now. So the first thing I would do is contend that most, having just recently studied all these job training programs, I can tell you that they didn't know all of them. And they didn't know how. Now, somebody knew their areas very well. We have great federal workforce. It's not, that isn't the problem. The problem is what we've done, and because here's what Congress does. They very well intentioned, very well compassionate. There's a problem. We try to pass legislation to fix the problem. But because we don't have great oversight and we don't have great knowledge, we don't know what's already out there. I can tell you specifically, in the last 4 years, I won't tell you which year because I don't want you to know, 2 times on the Judiciary Committee, I had to take a member aside and say, you really don't want to introduce this bill? And they said, why not? I said, it's identical to what's already on the books. In other words, we don't even know what's out there. So, I think one of the things I think we can do, and I was going to mention what, for example, bonuses. 96.4% of all federal employees got a bonus last year, even though their pay was frozen. Well, when I was trained in business, and when I ran business, either my standard was too low for a bonus, or I had the best employees everybody had in the world. And so, but we don't have that, we have semi-discretion And we've used that part because we've been frozen, and I understand it. I'm not against that. But I'm saying the only way we really satisfy the federal workforce is to make sure we cull out the programs that are truly duplicative and pay for the value that the federal employee is contributing, but make them also accountable so that we strive for excellence rather than mediocrity. And that's just human nature. So I think we can do a lot better than what we're doing, but I think the biggest problem in the federal workforce, it isn't the programs, it's Congress. Because we really don't know what we're doing most of the time because we're not aware. And hopefully at the end of April 1st, we're supposed to get the final third of this. And we're going to see. And so we're going to have a handle. And then GAO is going to keep this going. And so we have an active, live, know where we are. And then, you know, if we really took the time and we had a bipartisan cooperation, if you really want to squeeze some things out of this government, you can squeeze $2.4 trillion easy in duplication out of this government over the next 10 years. $2.4 trillion. I mean, that's a lot of smackers. And I think that's an underestimate because, well, for example, we have 2,700 different housing agencies in the country. You got a director of the housing agency, you got all them. Why would we have 2,700? And we've protected it parochially? Well, you can't minimize the housing agencies because your housing agency in one of your towns is going to scream at you. Well, it doesn't make any sense to have that kind of overhead everywhere. So we just got multiple layers of overhead that we don't need, but the reason we have it is because we don't know what we're doing. And so the whole base was to find out where we are so you can change that. And I think we're going to. I think there's a lot of desire. You know, the math wins on this. It's not red versus blue anymore. It's debit versus credit. It's profit versus loss. And we're been in the big dark loss column, and that math is going to consume us. And I don't know if you saw today what the CBO put out in terms of what they're expecting interest costs. It's about double what they estimated last year in terms of what every dollar that we spend on an interest cost is a dollar we're not going to have available for these programs. So it's necessary that we get the gumption to actually perform and work across the aisle and build the compromise. I can't get everything I want. Mark can't get everything he wants. But do it rather than say, "Oh, it's hard. We're not going to do it," and then have a sequester.
Well, Senators, let me thank you. I know you're awfully busy. Your schedules are busy. I'll end with this last opportunity just for you to make a comment as I thank you and express our appreciation for your participation today. We had CEOs and business groups, nonprofits, public interest groups, all kinds of interests represented throughout this afternoon who want to help. How can we help some bipartisan effort? Where will it form? Can there be a regular order process? Can there be hearings? Can there be a process where we could come in and join with you to give you some support? Because members will have to lead it, but I think there could be some support generated for this because you're talking a lot of common sense. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I was just going to say, I think one thing y'all need to know is I firmly believe that we have the right two senators over at Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs to do this. And I think they're very focused on it. And basically, that's the traditional role of the committee. We've added a big Homeland component, and the committee's been very focused on that for 10 years. We understand why, and no one's just disagreeing with that. But it's time to get back to really the oversight function. These two are very committed to doing it. So cheer these guys on, and let us work on it in the committee, and hopefully we'll come up with good legislation and keep working.
One area where you could help us is where you see duplication that might not be recognized. You know, the upward community. You know, I got people all over the government now since I've been working on it. Great federal employees tell me, "Did you know this was going on? Did you know this was going on?" So I had no idea. Send me the information. So we're getting people. Look, for our federal employees, if our federal employees want to stay at the level that they're at, both in terms of enumeration and numbers, what they have to do is help us find the waste. That's the best job security they have. Help us find the duplication. Help us streamline. Help us make common sense changes. And we, as Congress, need to give the flexibility to the executive branch so they can do that.
Okay. Well, let me thank Governing Magazine for co-sponsoring today, Castalia for moderating,
Good
Senator
job.
Coburn, Pryor, thank you very much for being with us. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being in attendance. We will be following up after this is done. We won't take time this afternoon to do this, but there will be follow-up on the part of the Roundtable and Governing Magazine. Thank you. We are adjourned.